They whispered he should never have lived. November 6, 1661, the Royal of Madrid groaned in the November cold. Its stones holding the day's chill the way a crypt keeps old breath, behind heavy doors and tight faces. Queen Mariana of Austria screamed into her birthing pallet, while priests muttered Latin in voices rough with sleeplessness. When the child finally came small, wheezing, oddly shaped, more than one midwife crossed herself twice. The boy's head was too large for the frame that carried it. The jaw set forward like a hinged misfit to a door it would never close. His tongue slipped and swelled, the mouth refusing to seal. The air smelled of tallow, smoke, and iron. Someone whispered, "Dios nos amper, God, help us." They named him Carlos, Prince of Asturias. Heir to the New World's silver and the Old World's debts. Heir to Habsburg palaces, fleets, saints' bones, and a family tree that curled back on itself like a serpent eating its tail. Even as he was swaddled in silk, the physicians exchanged the kind of looks men share when they stand over something that will not thrive. His skin was pale as candle fat. He wheezed as if every breath owed interest. The court called it delicacy. The doctors called it a weak constitution. The servants who scrubbed the linen and caught the blood and heard the night crying called it what everyone feared, a sign. They said the boy's first cry sounded strange in the chamber, as if the palace itself echoed it from within its walls. The priest said 100 masses. The queen pressed relics to the infant's forehead. The king, Philip IV, looked worn and old and did not say much at all. Spain the giant had an heir. The problem was the heir looked as if he'd already been claimed by something else. Habsburg blood had been guarded the way monasteries guard, relics wrapped, sealed, and never allowed to mingle with the common heir. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins. Generations of careful knot-tying in the same short rope. Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria, was also his father's niece. His grandparents and great-grandparents were similarly entangled. The portraits in the palace galleries told the story. If you looked long enough, lips that drooped, jaws pushed forward, chins that seemed to drift away from the rest of the face. The famous Habsburg mandibular prognathism, like a family seal stamped into bone. The infant heir did not thrive. He fought to suckle. Fever found him the way a stray dog finds the one open door. His skull loomed over a small body that trembled with effort. Tutors came and went with soft shoes and softer voices. The boy's lessons slid off him like rain off slate. Some days he stared into a middle distance only he could see. Other days he threw sudden rages, the way frightened children do when the room goes dark too quickly. By 4, he was not steady on his feet. By 6, his speech slurred around the big tongue that crowded his mouth. He could not chew. Kitchens pureed meat into gray paste, bread into wet clumps, vegetables into something between food and prayer. At table, soup climbed the corners of his lips and fled again, leaving trails that servants dabbed with linen. The court did not say drool, they said moisture. Beneath the euphemisms, the empire held its breath. Spain still stretched scarlet across maps, Naples and Milan. The Spanish Netherlands, the Indies, yet at its center stood a child who could not swallow without help. Even the most gilded throne sits on legs that can break. Everyone knew it, though few spoke it where ears might carry it to a confessor. And in the nights when the palace went silent, the queen listened for her son S, breathing the way a soldier listens for drums beyond the hills. September 17, 1665, Philip IV died after a reign heavy with battles and theater and daughters, lost to arranged futures. Bells tolled across Madrid in the slow black measure of state. The new King Charles II was 3 years old. There was no bright coronation. Spaniards did not crown their kings with jeweled halos and trumpets. There were oaths, regency papers, and the fact that the body in the little bed down the long corridor now answered to Majested. Queen Mariana took the regency. A council wrapped itself around her. Ministers spoke of prudence and continuity. Don Juan of Austria, the late king's illegitimate son, watched from the edges, a storm biding its time. Charles was carried rather than walked into chambers where men used words like realm and succession. His tiny shoes did not touch the mosaic floors. He drooped in velvet, cheeks damp, eyes wandering. He had a habit of fixing on one corner of the ceiling as if something very small and persistent lived there. Ports went out in careful ink. His Majesty's constitution remains delicate. His Majesty progresses in his letters. His Majesty shows devout piety. the truth lived between the lines. He tired easily. He gagged on bread. He slept badly. Nights in the carried their own weather-cold winds in August. Hot breaths in January, and sometimes nurses found him choking on his own tongue. Face turned the color of milk. The queen ordered attendants to keep vigil in shifts. Candles watched the boy like wary sentries. Outside the palace, Spain kept being Spain. Galleons loaded with silver trudged across the Atlantic. Soldiers drilled. Creditors knocked with soft knuckles and firm ledgers. Inside, time thickened. The regent mother ruled by parchment and favor, while the child who would be king drooped in chairs and tried to form the shape of words around a mouth not made for speaking, and yet he lived. That was the miracle or the menace, depending on who you asked. He lived, and with each month that he did, the stakes climbed like ivy. Children are supposed to catch up. That was the hope the kindly ones whispered in the corners. Give him time. God'll do the rest. Time came and did nothing but sharpen the outlines. Charles did not walk unaided until late, so late that court chroniclers, with faces carefully blank, recorded it as much delayed. When he finally shuffled forward, he did it with a sailor's stagger, hand to wall, shoulder to chair back, the spine bent. The head bobbed, too large a weight for the stalks beneath. The Habsburg jaw lengthened into its famous caricature. Painters softened it in oil. Reality had no such mercy. His teeth did not meet the upper row, tucked behind the lower, like a retreat. Chewing was a fiction. Meat became mush, bread a slurry, fruit an embarrassed smear. Eating took time, towels, patience, and a willingness to pretend this was all normal. Language suffered inside that architecture. Words crowded the tongue and fell out misshapen, wet, and slurred. Diplomats leaned in and still missed meaning. Secretaries learned to read the tilt of his head, the flutter of fingers, the way his gaze slid when a thought had run into a wall. Sometimes, humiliated by a sound his own mouth had made, he went quiet and stayed that way a long time. And yet there were moments brief, bright as struck flint when Charles wanted. He loved relics and processions, rituals, heavy choreography. He knelt before saints' bones with a sincerity that made even cynical courtiers look at their shoes. He watched hunting parties depart with the greedy stare of a boy who knew he could not keep up. In those seconds, you could see what a different body might have made of him. Spain needed a king who could ride and rally and bargain. It had a devout, damaged boy who looked at the world like a dog left on the wrong side of a door. Power abhors a vacuum. The Regency filled it with Mariana's will, favorites who understood her will, and prayers enough to salt a sea. The Queen trusted foreign confessors and domestic tactics. Ministers came and went like weather. Valenzuela, her chamber favorite, rose high enough to be hated, then fell in a crash engineered by Don Juan, who swept into Madrid like a corrective fever in 1677 and died not long after, leaving the palace to its old habits. Whispers, factions, controlled rot. Charles, now mid-teens, was present the way a portrait is present in a gallery. He sat in councils and said little. When he tried to say more, the words came soft and swampy and wandered off before they reached their destination. Courtiers, expert in hearing what they wanted, took the slack and pulled. He prayed, collected holy things the way a boy collects glass marbles, each one proof that the world might yet be ordered. He feared witchcraft, because men he trusted told him to fear it. And because the idea that his miseries had a human author was easier to bear than the idea that God had written them in his bones. Beyond the palace, Spain sagged. Silver dribbled instead of poured. Armies that had once terrified now negotiated. The Spanish Netherlands felt more Austrian than Spanish with each treaty that trimmed them. The empire was not dead. Empires die slowly, but you could hear the breath hitch. And yet the thing a realm needs most from its king is something only a king can provide. A future. He must leave a seed. The regent knew it. The council knew it. The baker on the corner knew it. They looked at Charles and calculated, with a private arithmetic, how many candles to light and how much hope to spare. 1679. A marriage to Marie-Louise, d. niece of Louis XIV, young lively, the kind of girl who turned corridors bright by walking down them. She crossed into Spain wrapped in protocol and expectation, traded the glitter of Versailles for the somber tapestries of Madrid, and smiled with the practiced grace of a girl who had been raised to be an answer. Everyone who could spell power understood the subtext. If this union flowered, Bourbon and Habsburg would be stitched with living thread. If it failed, the seam might split under the next hard tug. The palace stared at the bedchamber door with a tension bordering on prayer. But there are failures a court cannot spin. It did not work. Nights passed with the same result, nothing. Physicians hovered. Confessors hovered closer. Prescriptions arrived, tonics, baths, amulets, patience. The blame drifted, as blame does, toward the woman, because history is tidy in its cruelties. Marie-Louise, dutiful and lonely, took potions that made her wretch, and sat still for humiliations called medicine. Charles prayed and wept and prayed again. Impotence is a medical word with a moral shadow. It fell over both of them unfairly and would not lift. Marie-Louise did not conceive. She rode to distract herself, laughed when she could, wrote letters that hint at homesickness so profound you can hear the parchment sigh. 1689, 26 years old, she died suddenly after an illness likely abdominal, maybe appendicitis or peritonitis, though Madrid, quick with rumor and slow with charity, whispered poison. Charles stumbled the halls bereft, as a boy is bereft when the one friendly window in his house goes dark. Spain stared at the closed bedchamber and recognized a cliff's edge when it saw one. You can cheat hope, but not for long. 1690. A second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg, sister to an empress and sibling to women famed for fertility. She arrived with a greenhouse of expectations and a temperament, sturdy enough to live under Spanish tapestries without losing her color. If quantity of sisters' children were a transferable charm, Spain had cornered the market. The problem remained exactly where it had been, inside the king's body. Nights in the royal bedchamber produced the same bleak arithmetic. Physicians probed and measured with 17th century certainties, and 21st century readers will flinch at the detail. What mattered to the court was simple: no heir. Anna. Maria Anna quickly learned palace math. If you cannot provide a child, provide a party. She gathered allies, built a faction, and wielded piety as both shield and spear. In an environment where witchcraft explained what medicine could not, she did not so much encourage the idea as allow it oxygen. If a hex had tangled the king's body, a queen could hardly untie it by herself. Charles, aging in dog years, believed. Belief gave his misery a face and a name. His rosaries grew smoother under his thumbs. He became a magnet for relics, a connoisseur of processions, a supplicant at shrines. If you walked behind him, you heard the clutch of beads like a tiny machine trying to keep a much larger one from flying apart. Meanwhile, Spain's enemies counted. Louis XIV moved his pieces with feline patience. The Austrian Habsburgs kept their claims polished. England and the Dutch Republic watched both with calculators, disguised as prayer books. All of this didn't wait on Charles's bedroom, but it listened at the door. By the late 1690s, Charles's body was a ledger of failure. Dropsy swelled him. His fluids pooled where strength should have lived. His hair thinned, his skin sallowed. He slept like a man drowning jerks, gasps, the fight to find a position where the body would not turn traitor again. Enter exorcists. The church in Spain had hands in every room and a vocabulary for suffering that predated microscopes. Frey and others were called, ports memoed and counter-memoed, survived like charred scraps from a complicated fire. 1698 to 1699 brought ceremonies we would call exorcisms public enough to leave a paper trail, private enough to invite embellishment. Latin rattled the high air. Holy water shone on a face a painter would have called cadaverous. Relics pressed to a forehead clammy with the effort of being alive. What did the king feel? Counts say he believed. Relief followed right the way. Quiet follows a shout. Then the pains returned, as pains do, and he asked for more. It is not hard to understand. If a demon can be named and driven, then meaning can be forced back into a story that has become unbearable. If the foe is within, but not you, you are salvageable. The palace went further. Objects were purged, rooms sprinkled, items burned. A place as old as the collects whispers. For a season, the whispers were all about cleansing. None of it produced an air. None of it balanced the body's failing accounts. But in those rooms beneath those vaults, the rituals let a king feel momentarily and tormented, which is a kind of medicine, even when it is not a cure. Outside, the map kept shifting. Inside, the candles burned low and had to be replaced more often than before. By 1699, Charles had become an emblem of himself. The jaw thrust forward as if stubbornness could be anatomical. The eyes sunk deep. Teeth that never properly met made eating a performance of patience and cloth. His abdomen swelled with fluid, while limbs dwindled to cords. When he reached for a chair arm, the hand seemed to belong to a much older man. Sometimes he went silent for long stretches, not in contemplation, but in the exhausted way a failing machine pauses between efforts. Ambassadors wrote in cipher to their courts. The king is dying but not yet dead, and diplomacy hates the not yet. Louis XIV groomed his grandson Philip of Anjou. The Austrians polished the claim of Archduke Charles. England and the Dutch counted ships and coin and prayed for balance while preparing for imbalance. Everyone watched Madrid like men watch the sky for a tornado they can feel but cannot see. Inside the palace, the Queen's faction and its enemies circled each other like cats forced into a too-small room. Ministers who had built careers on careful ambiguity now sniffed the air for the scent of Bourbon or Habsburg to come. Priests still hovered. Doctors still bled and purged and prescribed with the sincerity of men without better tools.
Ow.
When Charles slept, attendants watched the rise and fall of his chest with the same attention they would give a lamp during a storm. Breath, pause, breath. The pause stretched, and still he signed. He prayed, he endured. Empire did the same. At the end of a line, someone must draw a line. 1,700 pressed in with its cold hands. Advice slithered around the king's bed in the form of counsel. The question could not be delayed. Who inherits Spain? The wrong answer meant civil war. The right answer meant war anyway. The Austrian bid Archduke Charles offered continuity of name and tradition. The Bourbon bid Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, promised a fresh branch grafted to an old trunk, and, to some, French domination in Spanish clothing. The technicalities are a labyrinth. The feeling was simple. Choose and accept the consequences. Charles, devout to the end, took counsel of confessors and ministers, weighed papers stuffed with reasons, and chose Philip of Anjou in his will. The logic folded faith, geopolitics, and desperation together. Philip would keep the empire whole. Spain would remain Spain. God would bless the rest. When the decision was inked, the palace quieted in that way palaces do when everyone is busy pretending to be calm. Couriers moved. Ambassadors sent panicked birds of paper across borders. Generals counted barrels of powder in their heads. The king folded into his bed like a man finally allowed to set down a heavy thing. There was still the matter of dying, which had to be done in front of people. Because kings do everything in front of people, living, failing, breathing, and then not.
Ow.
All Saints' Day. Bells that had tolled for others, tolled for the king. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died in Madrid, 38 years old. He had not yet reached 39, the last Spanish. Habsburg, fading in a bed, watched by those who had watched him fail to live the way a king is supposed to live. Death did not close the book. An autopsy was performed. Contemporary accounts survive in phrases that read like nightmare inventory. They speak of a small, withered heart, fluid-logged lungs, putrefied intestines, a body swollen with water, genitalia underdeveloped, and a head with excess fluid, what later medicine would call hydrocephalus. Some versions add that there was not a drop of blood, and that one testicle was absent or atrophied. Such lines may be the product of duplication and flourish, but the picture is consistent with his lifetime of symptoms, a catastrophic body failing in system after system. Even stripped of exaggeration and history like spice, the conclusion stands unblinking. The king's insides told the same story his face had told all along. The thing the portraits hinted at, the ambassadors noted with shuddering discretion, the servants wiped from his chin, it was all true. His body was a map of a dynasty's choices. Outside, Madrid caught the rumor of war like a cold caught in a crowded church. Inside, a priest closed the king's eyes, and someone finally let the candles go out. A will is not a shield. 1701 brought the War of the Spanish Succession, because choices made in royal chambers are invitations to armies. Bourbon and Habsburg claims slammed into each other across Europe and beyond. Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain, first of the Bourbons, while the Austrian Archduke called himself Charles III in Barcelona under the protection of foreign guns. The war chewed men and money until 1714. Treatisut, Trecht, Restatzt, Chet, a new order that still bore the teeth marks of the old. And Charles. He left no heir, only portraits that make viewers step a little closer and then a little back. You can stand in a museum and look into those heavy-lidded eyes, the mouth slack from a jaw that outran the rest of the face, and feel a particular unease. Not at a monster, but at a man who was asked to be a symbol with a body that could not manage being. The horror here is human. There were no demons in him, only decisions. Centuries of consanguinity meant to guard power that finally unmade the person meant to wield it. He was El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because the age used that word for things it could not fix. Biology did the work witchcraft received the blame for. Keep the story tidy, and it becomes a moral about hubris and bloodlines. Tell it true, and it becomes a long, cold corridor in which a boy learns he cannot eat without help a husband learns. He cannot father a child. A king learns he is a subject of his body, his mother, his ministers, his enemies. When the bells stop tolling in your head and the museum guard clears her throat because you've been staring too long, you may realize the simplest, scariest sentence in the whole tale. He should have been a child. He was made a king. Between those two misalignments, an empire leaked away. That is the warning Charles II leaves behind like a draft under a locked door. Power that worships itself will eat its own, first the face, then the future, then the world around it.